Hey guys, this is Anthony Morganti. I am MrPhotographer.com. Day before yesterday, I received an email from a person who told me that they were reading this article on my website. This is a really old article. It was published on this website in 2018, but I really wrote it around 2015 and had it on my original website and then transferred it over to the new website in 2018. They emailed me to tell me I was wrong, that just about everything, every claim I make in this article has been disproved. And like a true person in the world today, they just emailed me to tell me I was wrong, but they didn't offer any proof to back up what they were saying. So this got me to thinking. I know many of us on YouTube that are teaching photography say you should shoot raw. I mean, one guy has made a great career out of just that, telling you shoot raw. Well, I thought maybe I'll try to show it. Instead of writing it in this article, I'll just try to show it. So what I decided to do is this morning I went out. I had two cameras with me. I had a Nikon Z7 II and a Sony A7R4. And it really isn't important why I use two cameras. Outside of the fact I just wanted to show you the differences between shooting RAW and JPEG with two different cameras. Because I know someone will say, well, you're using a Nikon Z7 II, that's why it's doing that. So I just wanted to show it with two different cameras. It's purely non-scientific type thing I'm doing here. Just look what I'm showing, look at what I'm going to show you, and you could decide for yourself. Now what I did was I set each camera up to shoot JPEG and RAW simultaneously. And for those of you that may not be familiar with that, you could set up cameras so that when you take one exposure, the camera will save a RAW file and a JPEG of that same exact exposure onto the memory card. So I did that with each camera, and I set up a bracketed set of images so I could fire off some that were underexposed and some that were overexposed, and of course some that were properly exposed. And let's start there. This is the Nikon Z7 II. It was 1/125th of a second f8 ISO 64 40 millimeters on a Nikon Z lens. All right. So this is properly exposed. It's a RAW file. I have my Lightroom set up so that when I import RAW files, no edits are done to it at all, including in detail, no sharpening, no noise reduction at all. So this is what it looks like. And if I zoom in, you can see ISO 64, there's no noise at all. I mean, and this is the one that's, quote, properly exposed. And I use spot metering, and I metered off the grain elevator in the background there, and I did that for each image. All right. Now, this is the JPEG version of that image. Now, those of you that are familiar with shooting JPEG in camera you have settings where you could add an amount of sharpening, an amount of noise reduction. You could open up shadows. You could bring down highlights. You could adjust settings in camera. I have the settings set at their default positions. So default amount of sharpening, default amount of noise reduction, and so on. And if we just look between the RAW file and the JPEG's better. I mean, it's sharper, right? But of course, that's because I set it up so that it's doing some default sharpening to the image, whereas the RAW file has nothing done to it, totally unedited. So you know, that's just a kind of our base here. We're looking at these images as our baseline. Now, let's look at some images that are 4 stops underexposed. First of all, this is the RAW file. This is 4 stops underexposed, 1/2000th of a second, same settings otherwise. And if I go over now to the basic tab and I open up exposure, 4 stops. Now again, this is the RAW file. So we get it that it's more properly exposed. And let's zoom in like up here. Get a nice view up in here. All right, there's no noise still. So, you know, it did a nice job of controlling noise. It looks fine. I mean, it looks pretty much like the one that was properly exposed. Now, I just opened up exposure 4 stops. So the RAW file did a nice job. Let's look at the JPEG now. This again is 4 stops underexposed. Same exact image as the last one. It's just the JPEG version of that image. Let me open up 4 stops. You can see it's still a little underexposed. That's because the camera, when it saved the JPEG, it did something to it. It adjusted it best it could, and it brought down exposure. So now when I'm trying to bring up exposure, it's not bringing it up enough. So I have to add more exposure to this. to make it look more normal or more properly exposed. And again, like before, we'll zoom in up here, and there is some noise I could see here. Hopefully you could see it in the video, but there is some noise. Also, when I compare it to its JPEG counterpart, which is now considerably brighter still, that one is considerably sharper. All right, you can see this one's considerably more blurry, really, and it's still 1/2000th of a second, and it's just the JPEG rendition of the raw image. So it didn't perform as well. So underexposing by that much really made the JPEG suffer. And when you compare it to the equivalent RAW file, you could see that there's a significant difference. The JPEG just didn't perform as well. Now let's go to stops overexposed. You can see this one's 1/8 of a second. I handheld these. I probably should have brought a tripod, but I have a tripod in my car. I probably should have took the tripod out of my car, but 4 stops underexposed. So we're going to bring this down 4 stops. Now you can see it just doesn't look right. And when we compare it to the properly exposed RAW file, you could see that there's a significant difference. So the overexposing the RAW file just didn't handle it as well as underexposing. All right. Now we'll go to the one that is the JPEG, same exact image or same exact scene, same exact exposure, I should say. And it's 4 stops overexposed. And you can see that it's really unusable. I mean, this one is almost usable. Like if I was out and I accidentally overexposed Bigfoot and I was shooting RAW, I'd be pretty good. But if I was shooting JPEG, it would be pretty bad. So you can see now, as far as the Sony Z7 II is concerned, it handles underexposure really well with RAW, not very well with JPEG. It handles overexposure okay with RAW, but really not very good at all with JPEG. Now, again, some people will say, well, that's the Sony. What about, or that's the Nikon. What about the Sony? Let's look at the Sony. All right, here's one. It's 1/200th of a second f8. This is ISO 100. Now, the Nikons were ISO 64. I just used the lowest available native ISO in each camera. So this is ISO 100. 41.4 millimeters. It was a zoom lens, so I just zoomed it best I could, and you could see that this is the scene. So let's look at up here. Okay. All right, now as I look at it, it looks pretty much like the Nikon did. I mean, it's properly exposed. There's really no noise that I could make out. Now, it's, again, when I imported it, I didn't add any sharpening, no noise reduction, just some color noise reduction on each of them. But other than that, nothing. And you could see that it looks comparable to the Nikon. Now, we'll jump over to the JPEG rendition of this. And you can see it's like the Nikon JPEG. It's sharper than the RAW file because there is some sharpening going on in camera. And you can see that it just looks a little better. I mean, the JPEG maybe is a little more dramatic with the Nikon. Maybe not. It's about the same, let's say. All right, but now let's go to the underexposed versions. This is 4 stops underexposed, and this is the RAW file. And I'm going to go to the exposure slider and push that up 4 stops. Maybe, if I could do it. There we go. Too much coffee this morning, little jitters. All right. And then we'll go to the JPEG. It looks good, right? I mean, compare it to the RAW file version. Looks pretty much the same, not zoomed in. Let's go to the JPEG version, and let's push this up 4 stops. If I could. I don't know why that's not doing it. It's not rendering on my computer. There it goes. All right. All right. Like the Nikon JPEG, you can see it's darker. Because there was in-camera, processing done. All right, let's go back to the RAW file and let's zoom in up in here. And it looks pretty good. I mean, there is no noise that I could see. Again, it's a RAW file, so no sharpening was done, nothing like that, but it looks okay. Now let's go to the JPEG version, and this is darker. There is a little bit of noise. Look at down in here, like in the sky. You see the noise in here? If I go to the RAW version, no noise. So you could see here that the Sony JPEG didn't handle the noise as well as the Nikon JPEG, but overall, both JPEGs are acceptable. They're okay underexposed, all right? Now, let's go to overexposed. This is 4 stops overexposed. This is 1/13 of a second. Again, handheld. This is the RAW file. We're going to bring exposure down 4 stops. And looks pretty good. Let's zoom in. And I don't really see any noise. I mean, the sky is blown out. It is overexposed. But again, if this was something critical and I accidentally overexposed, it's kind of, it could be acceptable in a RAW file. Let's go to the JPEG. And let's bring exposure down. All right, 4 stops. And you can see, similar to the Nikon JPEG that was overexposed, this really isn't acceptable. There's a huge difference between the RAW file that's 4 stops overexposed and the JPEG that's 4 stops overexposed. So you can see that there's a considerable difference. So right there, I think it kind of shows that no matter what camera manufacturer you use, when you shoot digitally, that it's better if you miss to underexpose a little bit. And that's why many of us, you'll see, we expose for the sky. And when we expose for the sky, that means we're actually underexposing the image a bit. And the shadows will be very dark. But you'll notice that on these images that were, let's say, 4 stops underexposed, and if we zoom in, let's better zoom in over here. You can still see the graffiti on the walls in here. It's still retained that that information in the shadows. But when you compare that to an image that was overexposed, you could see that there's no sky in the bright area. There's nothing there. So it didn't retain that. So whether you shoot RAW or JPEG, always be cognizant that if you're going to be photographing a scene that has a lot of dynamic range, make sure you underexpose just a little bit so that you make sure that you don't blow out the highlights. And I think that would go across any manufacturer with, you know, not just Sony and Nikon. So Canon, anything, you know, Fuji, Pentax, whatever you have. Just remember. Now this, for those of you that are as old as me and shot film, this is similar to when we shot color slide film. Color slide film had similar exposure latitude as digital, in that we had to be careful we didn't blow out the highlights. Conversely, if you were shooting color negative film, that was the opposite. Color negative film, you had to make sure that you didn't crush the shadows. So you had to overexpose color negative film a little bit. If you go on YouTube and you watch a lot of the film shooters now, they often will shoot film at half the box speed. Meaning if they're using Portra 400, which is a color negative film, they set their cameras ISO or ASA, depending on the model or how old the camera is, to 200. And when they do that, they're actually overexposing it by 1 full stop. And that's what they're doing, is they're just being careful. They're not going to crush the shadows. But digitally, it's the opposite. We have to worry about blowing out the highlights. So it still is better as far as exposure latitude is concerned to shoot RAW, because it just will preserve itself in the highlights better than JPEG will. And JPEG holds its own in the shadows, but you can see some of them were darker, as I said. So you know, have exposure all the way up to +5. It's still a little dark compared to the properly exposed JPEG. So that's it. I hope that made sense. Again, it's not scientific. I don't claim it to be. It's just something you could observe. I encourage you to shoot for yourself. Try it. Try with your cameras. Set up a bracket so that you have one shot that is properly exposed, one shot that is 4 stops under, another stop that is 4 stops over, or maybe you don't want to do it that much. Maybe just 1 stop under and 1 stop over and stuff like that, and see how your camera performs shooting RAW and JPEG and see which is better. Thank you, everyone who watches my videos. I really do appreciate it. I'll talk to you guys soon.